One Friday evening in 1973, Mike Shea, a Vietnam veteran and law student at the University of Baltimore, finished his classes for the day, and now being free for the evening, went to visit a friend at a bar in Olney. Mike was barely 15 miles outside of Baltimore when he saw a continuous beam of light, or energy, strike a barn to his left. He then noticed a UFO with a ring of red and yellow lights. He was aghast at the sight and rolled his window down. He was able to discern that the object was hovering in complete and utter silence. The beam finally dissipated, and a wave of dread overtook Mike. He felt as if something was behind him. The UFO then began to move and flew directly over his head, and he experienced what felt like electricity arcing down his spine. And suddenly, the close encounter was over, and Mike found himself feeling relaxed, driving into Olney. He went into the bar to meet his friend, who was nowhere to be found. The bartender explained that Mike's friend left 2 hours ago. Mike then realized that he had 2 hours for which he could not account for. This encounter troubled Mike for years and weighed on him so much that decades later, he decided to undergo hypnotic regression with abduction researcher Bud Hopkins. Once regressed to the point of the missing time, Mike remembered an overpowering fear which pleaded with him not to look up at the object. He drove, hoping to escape the unknown, when he saw 4 people standing on the side of the road, but these people weren't human. Mike described the appearance of these bizarre insect-like creatures, which he compared to grasshoppers. They wore what appeared to be some sort of black armor with black helmets. A black line ran down the center of their helmets, coming to a point. The beings had long arms and bowed legs which reminded Mike of a monkey. The 4th creature was noticeably smaller than the other 3, and when looking at it, Mike had the strange sensation that the smaller being was ancient. For whatever reason, Mike stepped out of the car against his fear and looked up at the UFO. Bright lights shone down on him, and a low whirring sound seemed to emanate from the object. Mike noticed a second, smaller craft, which appeared to land on the ground. The insectoid non-humans took Mike aboard one of the crafts, abducting him. The bugs placed him on a table and methodically examined him before extracting biological samples from his body. This abduction case is very similar to a lot of other cases that I've read about, with a lot of commonalities that are well documented by abduction researchers. Missing time is a well-documented aspect of the UFO phenomenon. The appearance of the insect-like creatures during the abduction experience is also very commonly reported. What really stands out to me is the fact that Mike felt the smallest of the creatures was somehow ancient. September 12th, 1973. In Kent, Connecticut, 2 17-year-old young men were driving north on Route 7 from Westchester County. They were within miles south of the nearest town when they saw something strange in the sky. A large oval-shaped object with flashing multicolored lights was hovering over a ridge on the west side of the Housatonic River. They were shocked by the surreal object, so much so that they pulled over to watch it. They were watching the object by the side of the road when another car also pulled over to watch the mysterious object. A teenage couple got out and joined the original witnesses. To the east, on Spooner Hill, a man was driving to his friend's house when he also saw the object. In disbelief, he drove on to his friend's house to show his friend and his wife the UFO. The 2 groups of witnesses, the adults and the teenagers, met up. Together, they continued observing the phenomenon and noticed that the large object had vanished. In its place, it's reported that at least a dozen lights, or orbs, flew in a circular pattern around the ridge before falling into a straight line formation. This line of orbs flew towards Mount Angelo. They dropped the 2 extra witnesses off, and the original 7 witnesses continued to follow the orbs and cross the bridge to the mountain. They chased the orbs to a field at the base of Mount Anglo, but they seemed to have vanished. However, a sighting was also reported by a group of 3 women who were camping on the other side of the mountain. They saw the orbs travel down the other side of the mountain, opposite to our group of 7. The group was at a loss with the apparent disappearance of the objects, and so they went back to the bridge which they just crossed. It was there that they came across a white car that wasn't there before, as well as 2 women. They found this very strange and approached the 2 women, who told the group they were waiting for a group of, quote, hikers, who, an hour earlier, reportedly told the women they were, quote, hiking over the mountain. At that moment, a large group of 15 to 20, quote, hikers emerged from Sasquatch Road. They were jogging towards the witnesses, wearing what appeared to be lighted miners' helmets, and carrying rods or poles. The hikers were all mumbling or chanting. The young men tried to speak to the unsettling hikers, but they ignored them. The hikers continued jogging and split around both sides of the car, continuing on their path. The witnesses felt this was too strange, and so they pursued these hikers. Despite their best efforts, the hikers seemed to vanish, leaving no trace. Just as they thought this Fortean ordeal was over, the witnesses realized that something was wrong. The younger witnesses realized that they had a 2-hour period of missing time, which they couldn't explain. The adults, too, realized that their memories following the appearance of the strange hikers were hazy. It's reported that they could not remember what they did or where they went after the sudden appearance of the hikers. It's reported that some of these witnesses later underwent hypnotic regression in an attempt to recover their memories. However, these details have not been made public, leading some to believe that their memories weren't positive, and that perhaps these hikers weren't what they initially appeared to be. The phenomenon of screen memories is widely reported within the UFO lore, with the idea being that the intelligence behind the UFO phenomenon is capable of altering or manipulating memories, as well as perhaps human perception itself, in order to disguise or cloak itself. Others believe that these screen memories serve as markers of significant events. October 25th, 1973, at the Kowalczyk farm near Uniontown, Pennsylvania. Over a dozen people in the rural community around the Kowalczyk farm reported witnessing a large luminous red orb, which was hovering roughly 100 feet in the air over a field. The farmer's son, 22-year-old George Kowalczyk Jr., and his wife were driving when they saw the red UAP. When they reached their home, they found their family members were already watching the phenomenon. Steve decided to investigate with his .30-06 rifle and 6 rounds, 2 of which were tracers. Along the way, he encountered 2 twin boys from the neighborhood, Rick and Nick. The 2 of them were also going to investigate, so Steve had them hop in his truck with him. As they were riding, they noticed all the dogs in the area were barking, seemingly voicing their concern at the interloping object. Together, they drove towards the anomaly, which appeared to be descending toward George's father's field. As they got closer, they heard a whirring noise compared to a lawnmower, and the unnerving, quote, mournful sounds of a baby crying, or perhaps a woman screaming. As they drew near to the object, the vehicle's headlights began to fail. Yet another example of the electromagnetic effect observed in the presence of the UFO phenomenon. As they got closer, they saw that it was now barely hovering over the ground. The witnesses' eyes began to water from the object's sheer intensity and luminosity. The illuminated orb landed and now appeared to be a bright white, dome-shaped object. They estimated it was 100 feet in diameter, and the witnesses could smell a sulfuric odor, which they compared to a burning tire. Quote, "It was dome-shaped, just like a big bubble. It was making a sound like a lawnmower," Kowalczyk stated. It was around that time when one of the boys, frightened, noticed two dark figures walking upright along the fence behind the object, slowly striding towards the three witnesses. George, who wore glasses for his myopia and other ocular ailments, initially thought the figures were bears. This fence was 6 feet tall, and the taller of the two beings was running its hand along the fence. This taller being was estimated to be over 8 feet tall, and the smaller one was 7 feet tall. Both were covered in long dark gray fur and appeared to have no neck. Their eyes seemed to glow a green-yellow color. They had long arms hanging to their knees. George noted that the smaller being seemed to take longer strides in order to keep up with the larger creature. The creatures were making whining sounds, which could have been easily mistaken for either a baby crying or a woman screaming. They seemed to be communicating back and forth. Each time the larger creature would reach the next fence post, it would wail, which appeared to signal the smaller creature's permission to advance. Could this be a parent and child? Eventually, the creatures were directly diagonal to the witnesses. At this point, one of the twins, Rick, started screaming and ran away, while the other, Nick, grabbed George's leg in fear and begged him to shoot the creature. George fired one of his tracer rounds over the giants' heads with little reaction from the beings. He fired another tracer round towards the beings as a warning shot. The larger creature raised its right hand as if to catch the tracer round, and at that moment, the glowing object vanished, and the whirring sound ceased. They noticed an intense glow on the ground where the object used to be. The two creatures turned away and started following the fence back, slowly retreating. Nick screamed, and George fired off 3 rounds directly at the man-beasts as they walked away, having a distinct sense that the creatures were not friendly. He was sure that 2 of the 3 shots made their way into the larger creature's chest, but the impact made a strange sound, as if George was firing into water. He described it as, quote, "like shooting into a lake, like water plopping." The creatures appeared to be unfazed by the gunfire. One of them looked back at the witnesses with its glowing green eyes. The witnesses ran away, escaping to the safety of George's truck. Their eyes were very irritated, and this, too, is a common biological effect of these encounters. In fact, biological effects are considered to be the 6th observable, or characteristics of true UFO encounters. Many UFO researchers, including John Keel, noted many cases of eye burns and irritations associated with UFO encounters, and government documents also reference eye burns and related biological damage from UFO encounters. This document can be found in the description, and I really recommend reading it if you haven't. It's horrifying. The witnesses drove back to the Kowalczyk house and told the family what they saw, and they soon called the police. State Trooper Byrne arrived at 9:45. He and George rode to the site of the encounter to investigate. The glowing white area or ring was still there, the only trace evidence left of the UFO. The trooper even moved his vehicle to make sure the glow wasn't being caused by his headlights. They noted that the animals in the area seemed weary and avoidant of the glowing region, which was 150 feet in diameter, with its luminosity reaching a foot off the ground. The trooper stated that the glow was bright enough to read a newspaper, and that the temperature inside the glow was seemingly warmer than the outside. In that instance, they heard something stomping through the forest, coming toward them. As they moved, the noise seemed to mirror or parallel their movements. When they stopped, there would be a few more footsteps, followed by silence. Kowalczyk loaded his last bullet as they heard something before them. The trooper shined his light on what appeared to be the larger of the 2 hairy beasts, only 10 feet away. George fired directly at the creature, and it wobbled back and forth before charging at them. The men turned and ran as the beast slammed into the fence between them. Later investigation would find damage to the wire of the fence where the creature allegedly struck it. State Trooper Byrne and George escaped safely and fled to the Uniontown State Police Barracks, where they were interviewed separately. Their stories were found to match up, and after this, the authorities chose to call the Westmoreland County UFO Study Group. During 1973, there was yet another powerful wave of UFO activity, as there were in previous years, such as 1947, 52, 66, etc. In Pennsylvania, what is now known as one of the largest waves of UFO and Sasquatch or Bigfoot type reports were taking place concurrently. As the Westmoreland County UFO Study Group was well connected, local police departments would contact the group's leader, Stan Gordon, for any UFO or creature reports. At 10:30, Stan Gordon received a call from the trooper. Gordon spoke to the trooper and George and noted that both sounded shaken and sincere. The trooper urged Gordon to send a team to the Kowalczyk farm as fast as possible. Luckily, by this point, Gordon's organization had a system of sending teams of investigators out to cases very quickly, sometimes minutes to hours following the encounter. So Stan contacted some of his team, among them George Lutz, a former Air Force officer and pilot. Once assembled, the UFO researchers were joined by George Kowalczyk, his father, Kowalczyk Sr., and the two twins, Rick and Nick. At 1:45, the team was searching for evidence when George and his father, who were standing by the truck, witnessed a bright green light envelop the farmhouse. Two of the men investigated but found nothing. 15 minutes later, the team headed into the tree line where the creatures were encountered. They noticed that a lone bull seemed to be ignoring the group completely, but was instead petrified by something ahead of the group. The Kowalczyk dog, who accompanied the team, also became upset. The dog would sniff the ground and advance as if it was tracking something. The dog, too, seemed interested in something behind the tree line, just like the bull. As they advanced, George recounted the series of events to the researchers, and together they discussed ways they could possibly gather evidence. Lutz, the former USAF officer, noticed that George stopped responding to his questions. He looked back and saw that something was wrong with George. He was rubbing his hands all over his head. He looked like he was about to faint. His father, Kowalczyk Sr., and Lutz tried to help George, who began breathing heavily. George then pushed both of the men to the ground hard and let out an animalistic scream. He began walking and swinging his arms erratically like a wild animal. The Kowalczyk dog even tried to attack George. George charged at his family's dog, waving his arms and growling at it, and the dog ran away whimpering. Everyone was chasing George, trying to get him under control. He continued stomping and waving his arms before unleashing a particularly powerful, animalistic scream, so powerful that everyone was taken aback. Stan Gordon later stated that George roared in a way that you couldn't duplicate with the human voice. After his powerful scream, George fell face first onto a pile of manure. As the team tried to help George up, another member fell to his knees, feeling lightheaded, and then became short of breath. The group then smelled a sulfuric odor like rotting eggs, and quickly vacated the area, practically dragging George. George was groaning and warned the group that there was something in the field with them and that they needed to get away. At one point, George fell and lost his glasses. When they tried to give George his glasses back, he asked who they belonged to and said that he didn't need them because he could see fine. Once recovered, George told the group that while he was in his altered state in the field, he saw the apparition of a figure in a black robe or cape carrying a sickle. This entity in black communicated to George that the world will be destroyed if man does not change his ways. He was also shown visions of the world burning. This was very out of the ordinary for George, as he was not particularly religious, nor did he have an interest or belief in the paranormal, UFOs, or Sasquatch. It was reported that the twin who ran away during the encounter also suffered from apocalyptic visions of mass destruction, similar to George. These types of visions are commonly reported among alien abduction or contactee experiences. George's altered state was a real point of concern among researchers. Some compared this altered state to demonic or diabolical possession. It was hypothesized that the creatures may have controlled George's mind. Stan Gordon has since investigated other cases where similar phenomena have been reported. George's own father reportedly stated that he believed his son was possessed by the Sasquatch-type creatures they encountered that night. Following the incident, the farm animals refused to go near the site of the encounter. Others would follow up with George, all of which found him and the other witnesses to be sincere. Stan Gordon noted that shortly after this encounter, he received another report of nearly identical bipedal creatures with the same glowing green-yellow eyes. His organization even received another account from a nearby farm on the same day as the Kowalczyk case. To say that George was disturbed by the encounter would be an understatement. When the encounter was discussed, or certain questions were asked, George would start to involuntarily hyperventilate and fall into what was described as a trance-like state. Out of concern for George, Gordon contacted Dr. Berthold Schwartz, a respected psychiatrist who had previous experiences with witnesses to UFOs and paranormal phenomena. Dr. Schwartz evaluated George and, like all others, found him to be honest and sincere. But rather than demonic possession, Dr. Schwartz hypothesized that George suffered a fugue state. If the phenomenon played some part in George's altered state, even indirectly, this would not be all that surprising, as amnesia, missing time, screen memories, and other psychological effects often befall experiencers. These types of encounters can induce powerful ontological shock, with the witness feeling as though the foundation of their very reality is being shaken. It may be especially worse with witnesses like George, who had no interest or belief in UFOs or other unexplained phenomena. This is compounded by the fact that George was off his medication when the encounter took place. It was the professional opinion of Dr. Schwartz that George's fugue state was possibly brought on by the lack of medication combined with the stress and ontological shock of the encounter. Dr. Schwartz stated, "The unusual circumstances and the facts that various segments of events at different times were witnessed by 13 people indicate the reality of the experiences. In all instances, it seemed that George and the others were truthful." George told his story the same way to the state troopers, Stan Gordon's team, and Dr. Schwartz, and it was confirmed independently from all the other witnesses. An analysis of the ballistics at the scene confirmed that aspect of the witness accounts as well. Dr. Schwartz found no evidence of sociopathic behavior, drug use, or dishonesty. As with many other cases, there was an anomaly that precipitated this encounter 5 to 6 weeks earlier. George and his wife had just moved to a new apartment and had a new phone installed with a private unlisted number. Soon after, George received a threatening phone call from an unknown man who told George he would be dead in a week unless he got out of town. He also claimed that shortly after this phone call, his starter wires were tampered with. Following the encounter, George experienced paranormal fallout, better known today as the hitchhiker effect. Paranormal and psi-related phenomenon began haunting George, though he was embarrassed to discuss it initially. George began to receive dreams and visions of the future. In at least one case, he allegedly foresaw a tragic plane crash, which he later saw on the news. In another case, George allegedly witnessed the apparition of what he believed was a deceased in-law which he never met. Dr. Schwartz found that George had no mental illnesses or precedent for his fugue state, which was described as an outstanding solitary event. Schwartz went on to state that George had no memory of his fugue state. Hypnotic therapy was advised against for the time being by Dr. Schwartz, due to the trauma George was suffering from the close encounter. However, years later, Stan Gordon approached Dr. Schwartz and George in a follow-up interview with the possibility of trying hypnotic regression in order to recover George's lost memories. When Stan Gordon brought this up to George, he was confused by Stan's request and asked why they wanted to hypnotize him again. George then explained that 2 weeks after the encounter, 2 men came to his home, one in a black suit and one in a U.S. Air Force uniform. He assumed these men were with Stan Gordon's group because they questioned him intensely about his experience. After he finished retelling his encounter, the men told George he wasn't crazy and then opened a briefcase. Inside were photos of UFOs and of hairy bipedal creatures. George recalled a specific photo taken in Georgia of a tall Sasquatch climbing over a fence with a small animal under its arm. George was told to point to the images which best resembled what he witnessed. The men then asked to hypnotize George, who agreed. After the hypnotism was complete, they thanked George and lied to his face, telling him they would remain in touch. He never saw the men again. He assumed that the man in the USAF uniform must have been George Lutz, from Stan Gordon's group, who was an Air Force veteran, but this was not the case. In fact, the Air Force officially ceased researching the UFO phenomenon following the phony Condon report and the closure of Project Blue Book in late 1969. So many questions remain. Who were these individuals? Could there be a common thread among these unexplained phenomena, mysterious creatures, and UFOs?